We greet you again. We hope you are well. Today, we will address another essential topic, which in a sense connects with the previous one. Once we have covered the basic aspects of both, we will be in a position to combine them to explore other consequences. As we already mentioned, you use language to manipulate the objects that make up your representation of reality in your mind. We already mentioned that words lack intrinsic meaning, yet you come to associate them with ideas and concepts. Let's try to understand what happens for those concepts to become part of your reality. You yourselves have recognized for thousands of years the possibility that there is a world of ideas where perfect forms live, and in your world, only reflections of them exist. As attractive as that idea may be to some, we regret to say that it is completely wrong, and the sooner you get rid of it, the better. In the world, there are objects, substances, matter. You perceive it through your senses, and your mind, after being exposed to many of these sensory experiences, begins to find similarities between what it now perceives and the memory of what it perceived in the past. In an attempt to facilitate the interpretation of reality, your minds discard details, unless they have a reason to focus their attention on them. This way, what endures is the general idea, in broad strokes. The absence of specific details in memory, as well as in the perception that occurs at every moment, makes it possible to find similarities between memory and the experience in the present, which allows you to almost immediately realize that you have already seen something similar. The direct consequence, given your mind's lack of attention to detail, is to categorize objects that are sufficiently similar to each other, grouping them into categories. To do this, which you do because of its practical usefulness for progressing in the present based on accumulated experience in the past, you begin by defining the very first concept, that of a feature. For you, a feature is something unique enough, but at the same time ambiguous, so that if you see something similar in a given object, it seems obvious to you that it is a feature of that object, something you can isolate from the rest of the object and liken it to other similar features of other objects. The most obvious is what your senses can perceive as an element that differs from the rest of the object. In this way, you subconsciously decompose an object into a set of sub-objects ensembled together, even if that object is a continuous body of the same matter, but with irregular shapes. This is especially true if there are acute or pronounced angles. Your tendency to create tools and objects from more basic components makes you think that in the same way, the natural elements around you have also been assembled from more basic elements. For example, your mind perceives the branches of a tree as something different from the trunk, and the leaves as something also different from these, as if the former had been inserted or perhaps stretched from the latter, and as if the latter had been attached to the former. Having said the above, we arrive at a fundamental idea that you would do well to remember at all times. In the world, there are no borders. It is your minds that create them. They create them when they perceive changes in the color, texture, density, or sound that something makes when hit. Your minds are especially sensitive to these strong contrasts and establish mental borders. Then you say that on one side of this imaginary border, one thing ends, and on the other side, the other begins. Of course, we do not deny that different manifestations of matter exist with different external characteristics, due in turn to their different internal characteristics. Still, we are calling your attention to the way you perceive these differences. In the same way, you observe strong changes in shapes, and that is a sufficient reason for you to consider that an object is subdivided into more basic ones. You observe a tree and distinguish the branches from the trunk. You observe a human body and distinguish the legs, arms, and head as elements different from the torso. You observe a crustacean and think that its external shell is an addition to its internal organs. But we ask you, where does one begin and the other end? A millimeter higher or lower? Who decides? If you consider it, even briefly, you will understand that these distinctions are arbitrary and motivated by the contrasts in shapes or colours. But if you were to observe that same tree, that same body from close enough, as if you were an ant walking on them, the simple fact that your senses do not perceive the complete image at once would prevent you from noticing such distinctions. In the same way, you know that your world is a planet because you have been told so, or because you have seen images taken from outside, but you have never experienced it, since for the size of your planet, you are an ant. Having reached this point in our message, we return to the formation of concepts. When you observe different instances of objects, and with your subjective and incomplete perception, you form simplified images of them in your memory, you inevitably form concepts, these being a standard with which you compare new objects to look for common features with which you can try to decide if it belongs to that category, if it fits within your definition of a concept. At this point, it is necessary to distinguish between natural elements and those created by you. If you see a tree, you don't count its branches or the roughness of its bark or how many leaves it has. Your minds would tire if they tried to do that. You simply see shapes and colours in which you distinguish roots, trunk, branches and leaves, and that is enough for you to categorise it as a tree. This is because nature does not have a specific purpose, and you unconsciously know it, although some of you insist on finding it. In the case of artificial objects, if they have been designed by you with a purpose, it is to be expected that their characteristics conform to a standard, so it is more predictable or expected for you to know what it is and, above all, what it is for. For you, a two-wheeled vehicle is a motorcycle, a four-wheeled one is a car, and a three-wheeled one is a tricycle. Would you agree to call a two-wheeled vehicle a tricycle? Surely not. In fact, you have already used a name that describes the object itself, but imagine you have never seen a motor vehicle. Now you are presented with a two-wheeled one, with a handlebar that allows you to accelerate with one hand and brake with the other. It would be the first time you see something like this, so you have no references in your memory. You would not know what you are in the presence of. In the same way, in your past, more primitive civilizations could not understand technological objects shown to them by more advanced cultures that went to their lands. If, after the first vehicle is shown to you, you are shown another one that is the same but with 3 wheels, you would recognize elements. And since you don't know what the wheels are for, you would not pay as much attention to the difference in their number. You would possibly think they are elements of the same category. Only after seeing many more examples and understanding how they work, would you begin to distinguish them into subcategories. These subdivisions facilitate your understanding of the world. Let's now think about four-legged animals. If you use this characteristic to classify, you would consider a dog to be the same as a horse. Only when you include new characteristics can you subcategorize them, and you develop the mental concepts of one and the other, with which you will compare new instances of both as you see them around you. And when one is different enough, you will create a new category. But would a 5-legged dog still be a dog? With situations like this, your conceptualizing system will be put to the test and will not give satisfactory answers. And beyond that, there will always be details that your minds will ignore to try to handle as little complexity as possible. If you were capable of distinguishing all the details of any organism or element of nature or artificial object, and all these details were equally necessary and relevant for your knowledge of that object, you would not accept that 2 dogs, one with more hair than the other, belong to the same category. You only do so because you consider that the number of hairs is not a fundamental feature for the concept of a dog, and this is only so because your mind is incapable of this level of complexity. For another form of intelligence much more capable than yours, these two animals would be perfectly different, and it would make no sense to call them dogs. This may seem exaggerated to you, but in the same way, you do the same when observing characteristics that seem obvious to you, such as the number of legs, but which may not seem so obvious to an inferior intelligence. To banish completely the idea of a world of ideas, you must understand how your mind, with its conceptualizing process, being incapable of perceiving all the details of an object, ignores them, focusing on the features that are easiest to perceive. It will then group all the elements that share these basic features under the design template of a universal idea, which inhabits and has always inhabited and will inhabit an ethereal world of universals. Think about it briefly, and you'll realize that these universals are formed by abstracting a few common features and ignoring thousands of others that simply aren't easily perceptible. For a perfectly capable intelligence, universals as categories wouldn't exist, because each instance, each object in the world, would be perfectly distinguishable from all others, no matter how many or how few the differences between them. Therefore, for this intelligence, each object would be a universal in itself, and in that case, the very idea of a universal would be meaningless. Your concept of a world of ideas and universals, as clever and ingenious as it may seem to you, is nothing more than a demonstration of your own ignorance. We will also delve into that topic, but ignorance is a fundamental driving force in your lives, and most of the actions you take and your way of seeing the world are due to the central role it plays in your lives. Unfortunately, the ignorant person is unaware of many things, but one of the most important things they are unaware of is their own ignorance, and everything they don't know, since they have never even become aware of it. In the same way that your minds impose physical barriers to decompose objects into simpler parts, you also decompose situations into specific events by establishing temporal boundaries when you perceive a significant change in a process. We will address this topic on another occasion, and we end our communication here. Reflect on these ideas until you internalize them, and you will never look at the world or others in the same way again. The greatest enemy of true freedom is self-deception. Do not waste your life chasing ghosts when you can. Instead, understand that the sheets that seem to cover them are actually the blindfolds that cover your eyes. And once again, do not forget that everything you have just heard is language, nothing more and nothing less. Another illusion that you can dispense with as you develop your ability to analyze your own experience. Take care and see you soon. We wish you a reflective time.